Good morning. I'm Kevin Brennan with the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Thanks so much for joining us for another edition of On Point at Notre Dame. Over the last several years, conference realignments, increasing calls for student athletes to be paid, and lawsuits filed against the NCAA have raised questions about the future of big-time college athletics. We'll be exploring those questions today, and we're thrilled to have with us University Vice President and the James E. Rohr Director of Athletics here at Notre Dame, Jack Swarbrick. Jack, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
For those of you watching live today, here's a quick rundown on how the program's going to work. Jack is going to walk you through his initial thoughts on this topic, and then in the second half of today's program, he'll be taking your questions. You can submit your questions using the form just below the streaming player where you're watching us. You can start submitting your questions now, do so throughout the event. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can as time allows. With that, Jack, I'll pass it off to you.
Well, thanks, and thanks for this opportunity. One of the things that I most enjoy about my job is the opportunity to talk to our alumni, our family, all who care about Notre Dame athletics, and answer questions about it, because I do think it plays an important role in the university. And so the first part of talking about the state of athletics today, I think, is to remind ourselves of why we engage in it in the first place. What value at a great academic institution like Notre Dame does athletics play? Well, it plays several important roles. One is it promotes the university. It helps bring attention to it and give us a platform for talking about Notre Dame. That's really the story of how what we know today as Notre Dame athletics started. Its roots exist in a football team in the early 1900s, who became the first program under the leadership of a coach by the name of Jesse Harper to travel nationally, to schedule nationally, and to use football as a platform for promoting the university. We continue to do that today. I'm very proud of the Showtime series, which is giving America insights into our approach to our football program. We're in a studio right now, which is located in athletic facilities, reflecting the fact that we want to have the resources available to talk about our student athletes and our coaches and tell their stories. So it promotes the university. Secondly, it builds community. When we gather on Saturday afternoons, 80,000 strong in the stadium and 4 to 5 million around the country watching, we're celebrating Notre Dame. We're building community. We're coming together. And athletics has a unique capacity to do that. And we should take advantage of it and use it to help build the enthusiasm we all feel for being members of the Notre Dame family. Thirdly, athletics educates. It provides a route to education, and we talk about that often, in that young men and women who participate in Notre Dame athletics, that participation is one of the things that helps them get to Notre Dame and have the benefit of the extraordinary experience that Notre Dame provides to its students. But the sport activity itself is educational, and I don't think we should ever lose sight of that the lessons our students learn in the pool and on the ice and on playing fields and courts are in and of themselves very valuable. Many of you have heard me say before that I am never surprised when former student athletes who visit me, and they visit frequently, tell me how much they rely on the lessons they've learned during their time here from our coaches in their work today in boardrooms and courtrooms and operating rooms. That reinforces the educational nature of what we do. So on all those fronts, promoting the university, building community, extending our education or meeting our educational mission, athletics plays an important role in this university. It plays that role today in an increasingly challenging environment. We have seen that play out in conference realignment, in the restructuring of NCAA governance, In the cases that get a lot of publicity, where schools that don't necessarily choose to follow the same path we do get in trouble and use athletics in ways that were not intended or violate NCAA rules. They're living in an environment right now in this football season where we're seeing coaches around the coaching changes being made around the country in the middle of the season. All of this reflects an unsettled environment in which we work, a changing environment, an environment that's produced a lot of cynicism nationally. In the face of that, none of us can predict eventually where it will wind up. But in the face of that, it's important for us to make sure we talk about how we do it and what our approach to athletics is. That's why we have the Showtime series. In the national debate about what college athletics should be, we thought we should take advantage of that opportunity to use it as a platform to talk about our view of it and to show how we do it. Father Jenkins' recent interview in the New York Times, now 3 to 4 weeks old, was a very important part of that national dialogue. I am so proud that the president of our university was willing to step forward on a national stage to talk about the Notre Dame model for athletics, to draw an important distinction in the national debate, where he said the hallmark for how we'll approach college athletics, and will continue to in the future, is having it grounded in the relationship between the student and the university, between the student and educator, that we would not embrace a model which was one between an employee and an employer, because again, we view athletics as having principally an educational mission. I think that was an important part of the national discussion, an important opportunity for us to talk about our mission, and one that has continued to shape the dialogue that goes on. As I said earlier, where we're headed, no one knows exactly, but I am encouraged by the changes to the NCAA governance. I'm encouraged with the national dialogue that's going on, led by Father Jenkins and others, and I remain optimistic that college athletics can find its way to continue to be a central ingredient in the American educational system generally, but at Notre Dame in particular.
Jack, thanks so much. Reminder for those of you watching live, we're now going to be taking some of your questions. So you can submit them using the form just under the streaming player where you're watching us. Submit them now. You can submit as many as you like throughout today's program, and we'll try to get to a lot of them. Jack, you mentioned the New York Times story that Father Jenkins was interviewed for, and in it he talked about how while we didn't want to go to the semi-pro model, he was open potentially to, college athletes saying maybe they should be able to kind of monetize their fame. Can you talk a little bit about the university's position on that and kind of the difference between that and paying college athletes for their services? Sure,
and you get to that point by starting with the notion of what's the common philosophy here? What is our approach? And our approach is fundamentally that we want the experience of students who participate in athletics to be as similar to the experience of every other student as possible. So anytime we make a rule or a decision, whether it be nationally or on our campus, that draws a distinction between those two students, we've got to have a pretty high bar we have to clear to justify it. Because, again, the notion ought to be we want to minimize those distinctions, not draw them. So, in the case of cost of attendance, for example, the NCAA adopted a rule years ago that defined a scholarship to exclude a measure of cost of attendance. That's a federal measure of beyond room, board, books, tuition. What does it cost to go to this school? Athletics chose on a national policy basis to say, we're not going to let athletes get that. Well, we should have asked ourselves at that point, if a merit scholar can, or a need-based scholar can, why is it that an athlete can't get that additional aid? If we had asked that question back then, we wouldn't have adopted a bad rule that a court ultimately struck down. With regard to monetizing name, image, or likeness, we need to ask ourselves if the student musician can go play someplace on Friday night and earn some money, or someone else can use the skills they've helped develop at Notre Dame while they're a student to earn additional money to support themselves. Why then can't an athlete? And so that leads us to think we ought to be talking about rules where, without compromising the integrity of the athletic experience, without resulting in commercial sponsorship, you can still find opportunities. So the classic example of that nationally that's had a lot of discussion is the sale of jerseys that bear the name or number of a student athlete. In that circumstance, we ought to try and find some way, if we are in fact doing that based on a student's name, image, likeness, that they share in that.
And, when you talk about the cost of attendance, I believe that because of a new regulation, right, with the NCAA, we now are covering full cost of attendance. How has that changed the experience? What's the reaction been like from our student athletes that we now cover full cost of attendance?
Well, I think it's had two important consequences. One is it's eliminated a distinction between them and their fellow students that was artificial. And again, anytime we can do that, we want to do it. But secondly, it's dealt with some hardships. It has helped provide resources to some of our students who are athletes that help solve real problems about, whether it's getting home for a particular event, or some of the resources they need to succeed here at school, or simply to fit in. They now have a little more available to them to do that.
Well, we're going to take our first question from the audience now. The question comes in from Zachariah. If there ends up being a dual-pronged system, schools that pay their student athletes and schools that do not, how would Notre Dame plan on continuing to compete with those teams?
I'm not worried at all with the sort of the consequence of a bifurcated system like that, because we talk a lot to our peers in the industry, and very clear to us that most of the schools with which we view ourselves in common, most of the schools with whom we play on a regular basis, would, like us, opt for the model that continued to preserve the student or the athlete as student relationship. So I don't think you'd see much change. I don't worry about our ability to compete any more than I worry about our ability to compete now when we have the high academic standards we do. That is an experience that most young people and their families are looking for, want to have. So we'll have the same level of competition in terms of schools, and I think we'll have the same ability to attract talented students who want to pursue their athletic goals.
And what Zachariah was sort of referring to there is something that Father Jenkins talked about also in that New York Times article, that if a ruling were to come down that would say that, schools could pay their student athletes, some schools might go that direction. We and a number of other schools, like you said, would go in another. If that were to be the case, in college football or college basketball, would it be, do you think, kind of two completely separate leagues, or would we be, in that sort of scenario, do you envision it that we would be competing against the teams on the field, against the teams that do pay their student athletes?
Well, first of all, I want to be clear, I don't think that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so there's a little risk in devoting too much time to that possible scenario. I don't think it will. But if it did, I think you might see differences from sport to sport. I think some still may have a combined championship. Others, for reasons of broadcast agreements and commercial relationships, might not. Again, that gives me little pause for concern. I think there's an important question as to, long term, does a single national athletic association make sense? A lot of the challenges we have is the declining commonality of interest among the members of the association. I wouldn't be troubled any more than there are multiple sports leagues or other things in having more than one collegiate athletic association. I have no worry about either the interest in our sports or our ability to support them in that model.
Sure. We have another question coming in. This question comes from Anthony. And Anthony asks, what would need to change in the college football landscape that would cause Notre Dame to fully join a conference? So in football, I guess Anthony's referring to.
Yeah. Our first of all, as a predicate to answering that, let me say our goal is to remain independent. Goes back to the things I talked about at the outset of the show, that I think it's it serves the university's purposes and our educational purposes to maintain our independent model. The things that could change that are ones that I think are generally understood. One is if our independence proved to be too great an obstacle to participating for the national championship, that would be a consideration. Secondly, if we didn't have a broadcast partner who wanted to support us and allow us to use football to promote the university as an independent, that would be a challenge. Those are really the only two right now. We don't have any issues with building our schedule, especially in light of the ACC agreement. We don't have a problem with access to postseason. So those are really the two major risks that I see, and I'm glad to say that I don't think either is imminent.
Talking about conferences, there was a while a few years ago where in the media people were speculating that there was going to be an even greater conference realignment than what ended up happening, and that there was going to be kind of a development of these super conferences where you had 2 or 3 conferences that every kind of big college football or college basketball program was a member of, and that there was further speculation that could force us into one of those conferences. Has the sort of threat or possibility of that kind of passed at this point?
It has certainly subsided. I think that given the nature of the broadcast agreements, and certainly media rights were a driving force in a lot of the conference realignment, given that those media agreements and the assignment of individual school rights as part of those are now locked in for a decade, I suspect that we'll see relative stability. There may be some movement below the what are viewed as the Big Five conferences, but I think for the remainder of the next 10 years, I think it will be fairly stable. Beyond that, as they approach new media agreements, I think there is always the chance that there'll be some reconsideration of affiliations. I hope not, and if there is, I hope it's not significant in its size or scope, because I don't think we did ourselves as college athletics, I don't think we did ourselves any favors in the last round of realignment.
Reminder for those of you watching live, you can submit your questions now for Jack Swarbrick. You can do so using the form directly under the streaming video player where you're watching us. Jack, in addition to being the athletics director here at Notre Dame, you're also an attorney, so a great person to talk about some of the legislation that's been facing the NCAA that a lot of people are paying attention to in terms of how that could affect college athletics. I know one of the high-profile one is Ed O'Bannon's, the former UCLA star, his lawsuit against the NCAA, and there was a appellate ruling in that last month. Can you talk us through what that ruling kind of means for the NCAA and the status quo of things, and maybe sort of the general landscape of litigation facing the NCAA?
Well, first and probably most importantly, I'm a recovering attorney, so I'm not. I'm no longer licensed to give legal opinions, but I would offer the following. One is the O'Bannon case continues, and we won't know for a while, notwithstanding that we have the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision. There's a request there for en banc review. There's a potential of a Supreme Court reviewing it. So all we have is the benefit of sort of one stage in that process right now. A helpful stage nonetheless, one that while I think appropriately reaffirmed that the NCAA was subject to antitrust review, that it reaffirmed the educational model that we have talked about here, that it is not, there is a pro-competitive justification in the educational interest that athletics serves in college, that responds to many of the criticisms. But that's one of many cases. The lawsuits are stacked up like planes at LaGuardia, and it's a fool's errand to try and predict their outcome. They tend to all revolve around this issue of the relationship between the student who participates in athletics and the university. They go squarely to the issue Father John discussed in the New York Times article. And we'll just have to work our way through them. They relate to is a student who devotes so much time to athletics an employee is a central question. Can they maximize or use their name, image, and likeness? Are they subject to wage and hour rules or workers' compensation? Should we be allowed to have any controls, any rules on the number of scholarships or what's involved in a scholarship? Those are all cases that are lined up here, and we got to work our way through them. Hard to predict.
And do you think, are the federal courts the appropriate place to be kind of settling these issues for college athletics?
Well, that's a great question. You have to answer that in the context of what are the alternatives. I'm not sure. While I think at some point, if these lawsuits continue, congressional intervention is probably going to be likely, if not required. I don't think it's where we are right now. You would hope that. And I think the NCAA governance really moves towards this through more cooperative discussion, engagement directly between the schools and the students. Those students can help us find a way forward that satisfies their interests. And a really important thing to remember in this is that we don't view our athletics activities through the prism of two sports, and all of these lawsuits do. We view it through the prism of 26 sports and 740 athletes, and we don't draw distinctions among them. And that is an important differentiating factor here in the national discussion that we don't do a good enough job of reminding people of. We survey our student athletes every year. We talk to them a lot. We understand what's important to them. And I'm proud to say that their experience here is reflected by the input we get. They view very positively.
And when you talk about those other sports, like you said, so much of the attention is focused on football and basketball, sort of revenue-generating sports. How would, if the courts or someone pushed a model where student athletes from those revenue-generating sports were getting a cut of that revenue, how would that affect all the other sports that maybe are not revenue-generating? Would those students athletes just not be paid and still be on scholarship? Is there kind of a plan out there for how would they also be getting a percentage of the profits? What is sort of the consensus on that?
Well, there is no consensus, and there are no easy answers. We have developed over time a model nationally that says athletics ought to support itself. You can question whether that's the right model, or should we be viewed as any other department at the university and not necessarily analyzed on a balance sheet basis. But let's assume for the moment that is the right approach, that athletics ought to be self-sustaining. The Olympic sport programs would be at great risk if we went to a model where courts or otherwise people decided that only a small group of students who are athletes should be compensated in some way. I spoke a couple months ago at the National Swimming Coaches Association. This was a huge issue for them, as it should be. And again, it sort of misses the point of what we're doing. We believe strongly that the athletic experience and the educational value of that is no different for the fencer or the swimmer or the football player. And so we want the experience to be the same. We want to administer it the same. And we don't draw a distinction based on whether one produces revenue or not. And we think it's a mistake for third parties to try and impose that model on us.
We have another question coming in here from the audience. Excuse me. This is from Jill. We're seeing parents say they will not allow their children to play certain sports they feel lead to possible long-term health damage. How could this affect the pool of future athletes, and how can universities positively affect the safe development of athletes?
Well, it's certainly a concern. Anything that involves the health and safety of our students in any way ought to be of the utmost concern to universities, and so we tend to look at it in that context. I'm less concerned with its impact on the pool of talent, if you will. Sports is relative, and so there are some collegiate sports that have big pools of talent feeding into them, others that have very small pools, but the competition remains relative and equal, and so as long as you've got that, you're okay. But none of that trumps the safety concerns. Universities are and need to play a very important role in this. There are several things we're doing. One is engaging in research to understand the issues better. The focus is on concussions, as it should be, but there are other health issues that we're spending time trying to understand more effectively, research more diligently, and come up with better protocols, better understandings to ensure safety. Secondly, we've got to ensure that the rules of the game promote safety, and we are again actively engaged in that. You've seen major changes in football in recent years, all designed to promote greater safety. Third, we need to make sure our approach to the sport produces a safer environment. And so in my 8 years here, the change in approach to football practice has been very dramatic. Again, it's all related to safety concerns. Across college football, there's significantly less hitting during practice as a way to help ensure player safety. So all of those things, we got to, on the research side, on the way we conduct the sport, on the rules side, we've got to be engaged to make the sports as safe as we possibly can.
A big issue last year was Northwestern, their students looking to unionize, that ultimately was, struck down by the NLRB. What are your thoughts kind of on the idea of student athletes at colleges forming unions?
Well, the predicate to forming a union is being an employee, and for all the reasons we discussed earlier, we reject that model of students as employees, and we don't think that status changes just because they choose to participate in athletics as students at our university. The NLRB recognized, I think appropriately, regardless of the substance of the issue, the application of a rule which would allow collective bargaining among student athletes would have such a disruptive effect in the college environment, because most state institutions, students, by virtue of state law, could not organize. Mm-hmm. And so it would be largely a private school dynamic. And in an environment that has to have some measure of competitive equity to make it interesting. All sport requires competitive equity. Your handicap at your golf club is a version of competitive equity. You'd lose that in a model where some students had that right and others did not.
We have another question coming in from the audience. This one is from Mike. How do nutrition, injury prevention, and therapy, sports psychology, and competitive preparation, etc., enhance the overall experience and development of student athletes, the student body, and the university as a whole?
That's a great question, Mike, and it's an area we've probably ramped up our engagement and investment in as much as anything else in the past few years. I think we have gone from being a laggard in the area of nutrition for our athletes to being a national leader. Our understanding of issues surrounding recovery is really become excellent. We're investing a lot in these areas, because they are important to the experience of our students, because it helps them succeed, it helps them reach their goals, it helps prevent injuries. But it also does give us a broader opportunity to engage with the university as a whole. On one level, with research. So how do we engage faculty that have real expertise in numerous of these areas? Biomechanics, nutrition, other things that are part of this discussion. And so that's a great opportunity. But secondly, how can we take the things we learn and extend them more broadly to the university. So I think we have had an impact on food, on the food options available at the university, albeit indirectly, through our experience and our research. And so that's exactly the sort of dynamic. One of the things we're focused on now, which might be of interest to the audience, and one of the great obstacles to competitive success for us is sleep. Students generally don't get enough sleep, but students who are participating in athletics are especially challenged to get a sufficient amount of sleep. So we're trying to figure out how to measure sleep more effectively, how to promote it, how to build student schedules to allow for it. Some pretty interesting dynamics, which I think will have possible application to the entire university.
Let's take another question from the audience. This one comes in from David. Can you talk about the decision to admit students to men's basketball and hockey games for free and how that decision will help those programs?
Yes. This question refers to a new policy just implemented for this season, which essentially goes from a system where we charged a relatively nominal amount for student tickets to men's basketball and hockey. Other sports, other than football, were already free. And instead give them the opportunity to attend without charging them. We did it for two reasons. One is we just don't want any obstacles to students being able to come and support their fellow students at our sports events, or at least as few as possible. And so we saw this as an opportunity to do that. Secondly, frankly, we need a better understanding of when students are coming, how many are coming. And through the mechanism of selling only effectively season tickets at the front end, we'd have to hold that number of seats for each game plus some, and we wound up on a game-by-game basis with major gaps between who showed up and who didn't, and it didn't make for a great environment. This system of allowing students to come free does ask them to come online and secure their entry, and so we get a better head count. We know we have much greater idea of how many students will attend. Allows us to sell those seats if they're not going to attend to other people, and it'll create a better environment in both venues for our teams.
A reminder for those of you watching live, we're taking your questions. You can submit your questions using the form just below the streaming video player where you're watching, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Jack, in the media and elsewhere, one of the big kind of criticisms of the current system is that schools and conferences are bringing in millions of dollars of revenue from sports, and the student athletes are not seeing any portions of the revenue. What's sort of your response to that criticism of the current system?
Well, it rests in a couple of things. One is what we talked about earlier. You have to look at this, as we do, in the context of the entire enterprise, not two sports. It is absolutely true that the revenue from football effectively supports the other 25 sports. That's not an unusual model for a university. There are portions of a university which produce revenue to support other portions that do not, and that same model exists within athletics. I don't apologize for that. I think it's marvelous that we can have a system where we can support opportunities for over 700 students to experience the benefits of athletics, and the way we do that is by pooling the funds and not segregating them by sport. So I think that's a good thing. The other is that there are two things at the crux of that, the sort of the perception of it. One is the perception of a facilities arms race, and the other is coaches' compensation. We try and develop our facilities, address facility needs in a way that's consistent with the overall university model. For the same reason, we invest in building great dorms and great classrooms and great laboratories, because that's Notre Dame. That represents our commitment to excellence and providing the best environment for our students. We want to do that with regard to practice venues and competitive venues for our athletes. We do it through a university process that is the same process everyone else goes through. So I feel very good about that and the balance we achieve. with regard to coaches' compensation, you respond to market forces in hiring all personnel at a university. There are market challenges in hiring great researchers and attracting them to the university, just like there are difference-making head coaches. Having said that, I think it's important to look at coaching compensation, again, over the entire spectrum of our sports and not isolate on one or two. It is absolutely true that we have some very highly paid individuals who are coaches, just as we have other people in the university who are. But across the entire complement of people involved in coaching at the university, the average salary is very much in line with other educators at the university.
Many of our student athletes are on scholarship. Do you think that in this kind of national debate, about the future of college athletics, and when people are talking about the revenue issue, is it overlooked, the value of the scholarship, not just in the current day monetary value of it, but the value it holds, for the rest of these student athletes' lives, that they got this, education here at Notre Dame or other schools?
Well, we certainly believe that, and it's fundamental to our view that is the cornerstone of the relationship. It is getting that education. It is the benefit that it provides to the students over time, and so without sort of getting into the economics of it, I think very fundamentally in terms of the relationship and what the core value is that we provide, that is it. But when you do get into the economics of it, it's pretty interesting. You have opportunities, you have direct comparisons available to you. For those who would argue that students who participate in athletics at American universities are being taken advantage of, in most of our sports, except for football, you have direct comparisons available to you. You can compare the economic reality of a student who comes to a place like Notre Dame or goes to the NBDL, comes to Notre Dame or participates in minor league baseball, comes to Notre Dame or participates in minor league hockey. And in every one of those cases, if you include the value of the scholarship and the room board tuition and the other benefits that are provided, there is no comparison. The average salaries in those minor leagues tend to be somewhere from the mid-30s to the mid-40s. A full grant and aid student who participates in athletics here, they're getting about $70,000 in value. So twice as much as their counterpart who chose not to get the education but go into a purely commercial marketplace in the minor league sport.
We have another question coming in here. This one comes in from Sean. Sean asks, do you foresee a time in which basketball and football allow for college players to get drafted and remain in school, similar to the model that hockey uses?
I think there are versions of that which we will probably see. We'll have the opportunity to evaluate as legislative proposals coming up. Whether the draft rights are retained, I do think there's probably benefit in finding ways to allow students to explore their opportunities and make a decision to return to school if they're not evaluated as highly as they might want to be by the professional sports. So I do think more flexibility in that. The better information we can get to our students about those options, the better off we are. So, for example, I think almost certainly there'll be a relaxation in the rules regarding being represented by agents. Let's allow students, as we do any student, to get better information about their future options, to make informed choices. And I think if we do that, we'll see fewer students make the wrong choice, to make a bad decision based on the self-interest of someone who's trying to get them to leave school. And make more informed decisions. Again, whether that extends to draft rights being retained, a la hockey, I'm not so sure that will happen. But I think greater access to information, an opportunity to test the draft waters, perhaps. You'll see versions of that. Of all the models we have, and one of the challenges we have in athletics is it changes from sport to sport. Obviously, you've got the one-and-done rule in basketball, a rule, by the way, we have nothing to do with. It's negotiated between the NBA and the Players Union. You've got the football rules. Baseball's, frankly, is the most sensible to me. The aspiring, talented baseball player, a la Bryce Harper, who has the ability out of high school to pursue a professional career, just as tennis players do, and others, let them do that. Give them a forum, a way to do that. But if they come to school, let's have a system that requires them to be committed to be in school. And in the case of baseball, it's through your junior year. I think that strikes a nice balance. Give those really talented students the opportunity, if they're ready, to go participate. And if they're not, let's have them come to school in a way that has them committed to being there.
We've got another question coming in from the audience here. This question comes in from Mike. Mike says, with the football stadium construction, how do you strike a balance between honoring the past and moving toward the future?
Great question. Part of that is making sure that when you make decisions like that, you stay tied to the philosophy of the university and what you believe in. And so for us, that project, the Crossroads project that I take enormous pride in, is principally about using key real estate in the university to meet a broad number of needs. To be a new home for psychology, anthropology, music, and sacred music. To give us new student resources like a new career center, a new recreation facility. To create a home for digital media, which is so important to the university's future. So when you start with the philosophy of integrating athletics and education and making sure when you make decisions like that, you're serving those goals, it puts you in a better spot. And only then do you get to the second question, the question raised here, but how do you balance that with the important traditions of the facility that exist and the things you need to do to make it more effective going forward? I think we struck a very nice balance here. I think we've done that by taking the approach that we're preserving the inner bowl. We're essentially preserving the Rockne Bowl. And we want the experience when you sit in those seats, albeit I hope the seats are a little more comfortable after we're done, that your experience is the same. You don't see commercial advertising. You see people seated in common environments. The focus is on the game. It's a tight environment. All the things that have made that such a special venue. When you look in the other direction, when you look outward, you are going to see differences. But I think that's a good balance. It uses an important asset to help us grow in the future, but preserves what is essential to its original form and format.
We've got another question coming in. This one is from Phil. Phil asks, what do you see as the biggest changes that need to be made to the recruiting process of high school student athletes to ensure fairness while prioritizing the student athlete's best interests?
Phil, great question. I know what the greatest need is, and I have no hope of getting to an answer for it. And that is that we are causing young people to make decisions at an age that is way too young. Increasingly in our Olympic sports in particular, we have young boys and girls at the end of their freshman year or during their sophomore year making decisions about where they're going to go to school. I cannot think of a way, frankly, that we can effectively legislate to prevent that. It reflects a whole bunch of cultural dynamics that are probably beyond the scope of our ability to control them legislatively. But that's the thing I would most change. I think it's unhealthy. I think it creates undue pressure. And I think it winds up with too many students making decisions, making commitments, and finding out as they've changed, as their bodies change, as their personality change, only after they get to that school do they realize that decision they made as a sophomore in high school really isn't a very good one for them. So I think it's a real threat to college athletics, and I hope someone more creative than me can come up with a solution to it.
Jack, you talked in your kind of opening remarks about one of the things you mentioned is there are some schools that maybe don't follow the same path that we do with college athletics. Do you think, as this debate continues, kind of about college athletics in the media and in the courts and elsewhere, does more need to be done to address the fact that some schools maybe aren't holding up the athlete end of the student athlete? The student end of the student athlete.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to be careful about that. Yes, I think we clearly have high-profile situations nationally that we can all agree are failures, and we need to understand how those failures occurred, how we can assure they don't happen again, and generally speaking, I think universities are diligent about doing that when they get in those circumstances. But I think there's another element to this that we need to be a little careful about, and that is to recognize that across all of this sort of rich panoply of colleges and universities that are part of the association, there are very different models. And I'll give you an example. There is frequently and appropriately a focus on graduation rates. Very proud of Notre Dame's graduation rates. Overall tend to be 97, 98% for our students who are athletes. And that's something to be proud of. We've led the nation in that measure consistently in recent years. But really evaluating that, it's an analysis that should be done in the context of the university itself. We should have those sorts of rates because our university does. What a school whose general population may only graduate at the 65% rate, if their athletic program graduates at that same rate, students are in their athletic program, I think that's okay. We may wish that university had a higher graduation success rate, but let's not be judgmental. Let's not say Northwestern and Notre Dame and Duke have these high graduation rates and everybody else should. I think your performance in those areas should be consistent with your performance as a university.
We have another question coming in from the audience. This one is from Chris. Chris asks, any update on the practice facility for basketball? Will it be at Rolf's, and when do you anticipate it being ready for use?
So Mike Bray is using Chris as an alias now? Is that what's happening? Chris, it's a great question. We're spending a lot of time trying to work through that right now. Rolf's remains sort of the lead candidate here. We are trying to balance our need for a basketball practice facility for varsity athletics with our need to make sure that in the move of our recreation center to the Crossroads project, we don't net out fewer basketball courts for recreational activity on the university. That's the problem we're working through right now. I think we're close to resolving it. So the answer is it will either be in Rolf's or it'll be a new standalone facility, but it involves answering both questions. How do we provide a good experience for our basketball program, our varsity basketball program, but also make sure we're meeting the recreational needs of our students?
We have another question coming in from the audience here. This one is from Jason. Jason asks, given the educational value you've mentioned that comes from athletic participation, would giving academic credit to varsity athletes for their participation be a legitimate way to recognize and quantify that?
Great question, Jason. My answer is yes. I think there's work to be done to figure out how that works. And certainly I think there's a limit on the amount of credit that should be received. But in point of fact, a number of our peers do that right now. Some of the very best academic institutions in the country give credit for students' participation in athletics, and so I think it's something we should absolutely look at. I think you've nailed a really important issue here. If the athletic experience is viewed as educational, and frankly, if it's not viewed as educational, we shouldn't be doing it. But if it is viewed as educational, if they are in an environment where they're being taught by people hired by the university to administer that class, if you will, we really ought to look at the issue of how to provide some credit for that.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. This one comes in from Mike. Mike says, can you describe changes to the seating in the football stadium once the Crossroads project construction is completed?
Sure, be happy to. So in the bowl, as referenced earlier, we're trying to make as few changes as possible. For general seating, there'll be two changes. We'll have a composite material for the benches rather than the wood that splinters. It'll look the same. Optically, I think you'll not be able to tell much of a difference, but I think it will be a sturdier, more comfortable experience. Secondly, we're going to take, generally speaking, a seat out of every row to give a little more space for people within each of those rows. And again, we hope that provides for a better experience. America's not getting any less girthy as we move forward, so our seating needs to reflect that. And then we'll lose some seats, frankly. As we talked about earlier, we're still hoping very much to create a second tunnel entrance from the visitor locker room onto the field. That will take some seats. I want to remove as many people from the sidelines and on the field as possible, again, for safety reasons, but also to create the environment we want to create. So some of those people will probably move up into the seats. Those will be largely the differences. So at the end of the day, with the addition of the premium seating that's being built and some of these changes, I think we'll actually net out probably a few less seats in the stadium than we have now, but hopefully in a more comfortable environment.
Jack, we want to take the last few minutes here to talk about a few other topics in Notre Dame athletics. So first of all, the alumni and friends of the university have had the pleasure of being able to watch a 30-minute show every week about the football team this year with Showtime's A Season with Notre Dame Football. How did that kind of partnership come about, and what benefit do you think it's had to the team and the university?
Well, we were approached with the opportunity to do this. And I think one of the reasons that we were approached is our football independence. It was a little easier to work with us because of that independence. I could not be more pleased with the show. I think it has given great insights into the personalities of our students and our coach educators. It has let you see behind the scenes, and I think it has reinforced the messages we're trying to send about college athletics and what it should be. As I said earlier, our principal reason for doing this is we think in this national debate that's going on, against all the cynicism that exists, it's nice to offer a little bit of a balance point that lets you see these young men, all they go through, all they achieve, and the relationships they have with each other and their coaches.
Obviously, it's been so exciting for the fans to watch the show on Showtime, and kind of an extra thing to help us follow the team. The team's having an incredible season, and we're in the second year of the college football playoff, the new playoff system. Do you think, if the team wins out and finishes 11-1, do you think we're well positioned in that case to make the playoff? And how do you think, a year and a half into it, what's your kind of opinion of the playoff system in general?
Well, I have no idea whether we're well positioned, and no one does. There are too many other variables that are involved with regard to the performance of other teams. I will say I have great faith in the process. We put together a committee, and I sit on the management committee of the college football playoff. We put together a selection committee of people who work very, very hard, who I think are of the highest integrity and make the best decisions they can. They will never make an annual selection that pleases everyone, but I have faith in the process, and that's all you can ask for. I hope we do have a successful remainder of the season, and I hope we put ourselves in a position for the committee to consider us as one of the ones worthy for one of those 4 spots. But all you can do is try and control the things you can control, and we do that by preparing the best we can and not looking past Temple, and trying to get ready for what's going to be a great environment on Halloween weekend in a packed stadium in Philadelphia. So we're looking forward to that.
Jack, we're a couple years now into our new relationship with the ACC and being a member of the ACC after many years in the Big East. How has that transition gone? How do you think our teams have benefited from being in the ACC?
Well, the transition could not have gone more smoothly from our perspective. That's not to say it was easy. It's very hard to integrate a new school into a conference. And in some ways, we present unique challenges with some of the policies that we have that we brought to the ACC. I cannot say enough about how supportive the conference and the member schools have been of our inclusion, how much they've worked to make us feel welcome and include us in every aspect of the conference. So it has been a very positive experience. It has really realized every one of the goals we had for it. For all the reasons we articulated at the outset, the things we had in common with those institutions, the geography of the conference, the cultural fit, it just has really, really worked well. The impact on our teams has been very good. When you go into the ACC, you've got to raise your game. It's unquestionably the best conference in both men's and women's lacrosse, soccer, I'd argue in both basketballs. The list goes on and on. One of the best conferences in baseball. You better get better. And nothing challenges our students and our coaches more than that environment. And we saw the benefits in our very first year in the league. We won the Capital One Cup for the nation's best men's program and finished third in the Director's Cup for the best overall program, both the highest rankings ever for Notre Dame. We did that because we had to respond to the competitive challenge of the ACC, so it's having a great impact on us.
Well, Jack, we really appreciate you taking the time out today to talk about this important topic and give us kind of an inside look into Notre Dame athletics. So thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure, and go Irish.
All right, go Irish. And thanks to all of you who joined us live or are watching later on My Notre Dame or on the Alumni Association's YouTube page. Remember to keep up with all the Alumni Association's past and upcoming online learning events. You can visit us at my.nd.edu. I'm Kevin Brennan with the Notre Dame Alumni Association. We talked about the Showtime show earlier. We're going to leave you with a little teaser for the Showtime show, a season with Notre Dame football, as well as Irish Connection on Watch ND. Those are your best ways to keep up with Notre Dame football throughout the season. Thanks so much.
Take care of business today for 4 quarters of football. That's how we do it at Notre Dame. Nothing else is acceptable.
We got a great challenge. So do they. They got to put up with us.
Outside. You fit that ball. Yeah, you end up fitting that ball inside the bucket in the little.
Just me, Justin. We're not going to do it out here. All right, the boys have already let it go. You need to let it go. Let's keep rolling on these guys. Let's go get the game winner. You feel me? Let's go get the game winner.
He's going in, standing up. Robinson hauls it in. Remember that Mason? Yes. That's a conference, bro.
How about them Irish?